The pill felt wrong the moment it touched Elle Priestly's tongue, a chalky bitterness that didn't match the usual bland coating of her hard medication. And she absolutely knew, something was different about it. Something dangerous. Something deliberate. Her twin sister Brooke stood in the doorway of the sunlit bedroom, perfectly manicured hands clasped together, face arranged in an expression of concern that didn't quite reach her eyes. Watching, always watching, as Elle swallowed with a glass of water that suddenly tasted like metal and fear. "You took it, right?" Brooke asked, voice honeyed with false sweetness, stepping closer to inspect the empty pill organizer on the nightstand beside Elle's king-size bed in the Priestley estate, the same estate their grandfather built from nothing. The same fortune now hanging in the balance of Elle's failing heart. The diagnosis had come 6 months ago. Hypertrophic cardiomyopathy, a rare condition that turned her own heart into a ticking time bomb. And in her fear and love for family, Elle had done what she thought was right. She'd updated her will to leave everything to Brooke. Every share of Priestley Industries, every property deed, every dollar in the trust fund. But with one sacred condition that Brooke use the wealth to support their struggling cousins, their aging aunts and uncles, the family that depended on them. But standing there in that moment, feeling her heartbeat stutter and skip, Elle saw something flicker across Brooke's face that made her blood run cold. Greed. Pure, undiluted greed. Hey, beautiful souls. Welcome back to my channel. I'm so glad you're here for this incredible story of betrayal, deception, and the most shocking funeral you've ever heard of. Drop a comment below and tell me where you're watching from. Are you Team Elle, or do you think there's more to the story? And if you haven't subscribed yet, please hit that subscribe button, because you won't want to miss how this unfolds. Trust me, this one will leave you speechless. Now let me tell you what happened next. Elle's vision blurred at the edges as she stood from the bed, gripping the mahogany bedpost for support, her designer silk pajamas suddenly damp with cold sweat. That had nothing to do with her condition and everything to do with the realization crystallizing in her mind. The medication had been tampered with. Someone wanted her dead, and the only person with access to her pills, the only person who brought them to her room every morning with that same false smile, was Brooke. "I need to use the bathroom," Elle managed, forcing steadiness into her voice she didn't feel, moving past her twin toward the ensuite, catching a whiff of Brooke's expensive perfume. Chanel, bought with Priestley money, mixed with something else, something acrid like guilt or anticipation. She locked the door behind her and immediately shoved her fingers down her throat, retching violently into the toilet, forcing the contaminated pill up and out, her whole body shaking with adrenaline and horror and the kind of betrayal that only family can inflict. Through the door, she heard Brooke's voice, saccharine and patient. "Ella, are you okay in there? Do you need me to call Dr. Sachs?" Dr. Emmett Sachs, Elle's childhood friend turned cardiologist, the one person she trusted implicitly with her medical care, and suddenly Elle knew exactly what she had to do. She flushed the toilet, rinsed her mouth, and stared at her reflection in the mirror. Same face as Brooke's, same green eyes and sharp cheekbones and auburn hair, identical in every physical way, but so different where it mattered, in the heart, in the soul, in the willingness to murder for money. "I'm fine," Elle called out, steadying her voice, playing the role of the trusting sick sister one more time. "Just a little nauseous. I'm going to rest." She heard Brooke's footsteps retreat down the hallway, those Louboutin heels clicking against marble floors like a countdown, and Elle pulled out her phone with trembling hands, texting Emmett 3 words: "Emergency. Come alone." Within minutes, he replied, "On my way." Elle sat on the cool bathroom tile, back against the locked door, listening to her irregular heartbeat, and wondering how long Brooke had been poisoning her, how many pills had been switched, how close to death she'd actually come. Her phone buzzed again. A text from her mother, Elle Priestly, the family matriarch. "Coming by tonight to discuss the Foundation charity event, darling. Brooke says you're not feeling well." Even through the screen, Elle could feel her mother's judgment, that perpetual disappointment that Elle had inherited the business sense while Brooke got the charm, that Elle was Daddy's favorite, while Brooke always had to fight for attention. But none of that mattered now, because Elle understood with brutal clarity that Brooke wasn't planning to honor the will's conditions, wasn't planning to share a single cent with the family, wasn't planning to let Elle live long enough to see through the deception. What Elle didn't know yet, what she couldn't possibly imagine as she sat there planning her survival, was that the betrayal ran so much deeper than a twin's greed, that the conspiracy reached into places she considered sacred and safe, and that her own funeral would become the stage for the most devastating revelation of her life. Are you ready to find out what happens next? Because this is where everything changes. Dr. Emmett Sachs arrived within the hour, slipping through the estate's side entrance with the familiarity of someone who'd spent countless childhood summers running through these same halls when he and Elle were just kids, with scraped knees and big dreams. Back before her family's wealth created the invisible walls that separated the Priestleys from everyone else. Back when Emmett was just the gardener's son, who made Elle laugh until she couldn't breathe, and promised he'd become a doctor to fix her even before she knew she'd need fixing. He found her in the bathroom still, though she'd moved to sit on the edge of the clawfoot tub, and the moment their eyes met, Elle felt something inside her crack open. Not romantic love, though they'd danced around that in college before she married and divorced Christopher Vance, the hedge fund manager who wanted her money more than her heart. But something deeper, the kind of soul-level trust that comes from someone knowing every version of you and choosing to stay anyway. "Someone's trying to kill me," Elle said without preamble, holding up the suspicious pill she'd managed to hide before vomiting the other, and Emmett's jaw tightened, in that way it did when he was furious, but trying to stay clinical, professional, the brilliant cardiologist, instead of the boy who once punched Tommy Eastwood for calling Elle names in 5th grade. He took the pill carefully, examined it, then looked at her with those steady brown eyes that had seen her through her divorce, her father's death from the same heart condition she now carried, her desperate fear of dying at 32 without having really lived, without having found the one thing she wanted most in this world, to matter for something beyond her last name and bank account. "We need to run tests on this immediately," Emmett said, pocketing the pill, then kneeling in front of her and taking her pulse with gentle fingers against her wrist. And Elle felt her traitorous heart skip, not from the medication, but from proximity, from the reminder that Emmett had been there all along, waiting in the wings of her life, while she chased after people who saw her as a prize instead of a person. "Who has access to your medication?" he asked, though they both knew the answer. Brooke handled Elle's pill organizer every week. Brooke, who'd been so attentive since the diagnosis, so caring, showing up at every cardiology appointment, with questions for Emmett about prognosis and treatment, questions that now seemed less like concern and more like surveillance, like planning. "My sister," Elle whispered, and saying it out loud made it real, made the betrayal solid and sharp as a knife between her ribs. Because for all their complicated history, the competition, the comparisons, the way their mother Paulette always seemed to pit them against each other like fighters in a ring, Elle had genuinely believed blood meant something, meant loyalty, meant Brooke would never actually hurt her. "There's more," Elle continued, pulling out her phone to show Emmett the text messages she'd been cataloging. Screenshots of conversations where Brooke discussed soon and inheritance. And finally, with someone whose contact was just a phone number, no name. Emmett's expression darkened as he scrolled through them, and Elle watched him process what she was saying. Watched the doctor war with the friend who wanted to protect her from this ugly truth. If you're feeling the tension build, drop a comment and let me know what you think Brooke is planning. I love reading your theories, and sometimes you all catch things I don't even see coming in these stories. Elle's deepest fear wasn't death itself. She'd made peace with her condition, with the genetic lottery that gave her father only 40 years and might give her even less. But dying without purpose, without making a mark that mattered, without ensuring the Priestly fortune did some good in the world, instead of just collecting dust in investment portfolios. While her cousin struggled with medical bills, and her aunt, Rita Connor, lost her home to foreclosure because pride kept her from asking for help. That's why Elle had structured her will the way she did, with explicit instructions that Brooke must establish a family trust, must support their relatives, must use the money to lift people up the way their grandfather had intended when he built Priestly Industries from a single hardware store into a manufacturing empire. But if Brooke had forged a new will, if she'd cut out the family stipulations, then Elle's death would mean nothing, would just transfer wealth from one sister to another, while the people Elle loved continued to suffer. And that thought was more unbearable than any heart failure. I need you to help me prove this, Elle said, gripping Emmett's hand with an intensity that made him meet her eyes. Really see her, see the determination beneath the fear. I need to know if she's really trying to kill me, and if she is, I need evidence before she succeeds. Emmett was quiet for a long moment, his doctor's mind clearly calculating risks and ethics and all the ways this could go wrong. But then he nodded, squeezed her hand back, and Elle saw something else flicker across his face. Something protective and fierce, and maybe, just maybe, edged with the kind of feelings he'd been too noble to act on while she was married, while she was vulnerable, while the power dynamic between wealthy patient and salaried doctor felt too complicated to navigate. I'll run a full analysis on this pill tonight, he promised, and I'll check your medical records to see if anything else has been altered. But Elle, if your sister is really doing this, we need to involve the police. We need to... No, Elle interrupted, her voice sharp with certainty. Not yet. If Brooke thinks I suspect her, she'll accelerate whatever she's planning. Or she'll destroy evidence. Or she'll... Elle stopped, struck by a sudden thought that made her stomach turn. Emmett, who else knows about my condition's severity? Who else has access to my files? The way his face paled told her everything she needed to know. The conspiracy might be bigger than just Brooke, might involve people Elle trusted, might reach into corners of her life she'd thought were safe. Your mother requested copies last month, Emmett admitted reluctantly, and Elle felt the foundation of her world begin to crack, because Paulette Priestly was formidable and exacting and often cold, but surely a mother couldn't. But then again, Elle had never thought a sister could either, and look where they were now. The lab results came back 48 hours later, and Emmett's hands were shaking when he showed Elle the report in his office at Sacred Heart Medical Center. The door locked, and blinds drawn like they were plotting espionage instead of uncovering attempted murder. And maybe they were because the pill she'd nearly swallowed contained digitalis, a heart medication that in the right dose could regulate rhythm, but in the wrong dose, especially combined with her existing prescriptions, would trigger a fatal cardiac event that would look entirely natural for someone with her condition. This is premeditated, Emmett said, his voice low and furious, and Ella watched him struggle with the urge to wrap her in his arms, versus maintaining the professional distance he'd always kept. That invisible line he'd never crossed even when her marriage fell apart, and she'd shown up at his apartment at midnight, crying about Christopher's infidelity, even when she'd looked at him with wine-loose vulnerability, and asked why he never tried with her, why he stayed in the friend zone. and he'd simply said, timing. Like that, explained the years of almost moments and loaded glances. She's been doing this for weeks, maybe months, Elle breathed, the realization hitting her like a physical blow, because her symptoms had gotten worse recently. The chest pains, the fainting spells. The episode last month that landed her in the hospital, where Brooke had been so concerned, so devoted, bringing flowers and magazines and sitting by her bedside while secretly pushing Elle closer to the grave with every contaminated pill. Elle's phone buzzed with a text from Brooke. Mom's coming for dinner tonight. She wants to talk about your will. Says it's important. 7 p.m.? And the timing felt too convenient, too orchestrated. And Elle's heart, her traitorous, malfunctioning heart, began to race with genuine fear mixed with something else. Something that felt like rage, crystallizing into determination. I'm not running from this, Elle said, standing from Emmett's desk and pacing the small office, her mind spinning through scenarios and outcomes, and the brutal calculus of survival. I'm going to that dinner, and I'm going to figure out exactly what they're planning. Emmett moved fast, catching her wrist and pulling her around to face him, and suddenly they were close, closer than professional. Close enough that Elle could see the gold flecks in his brown eyes, and smell his cologne, and feel the heat radiating off his body. Ella, you can't go back there, he said urgently. And for the first time since she'd known him, since they were 7 years old and he was bandaging her scraped knee with leaves because they were playing too far from the house, she heard fear in his voice. Real fear. The kind that came from caring too much. If Brooke knows you're suspicious, if your mother is involved, then I need to know, Elle interrupted. But she didn't step back, didn't break the magnetic pull between them that had been building for 25 years, and was finally, in the worst possible moment, becoming impossible to ignore. I need to know who wants me dead and why, and I need evidence that will hold up, and I need... She faltered. Something in her chest tightening that had nothing to do with cardiomyopathy and everything to do with the way Emmett was looking at her like she was precious, like she was worth protecting, like she was more than a Priestly and a patient and a childhood friend. I need to know someone's on my side, she finished quietly, and Emmett's thumb was tracing circles on her wrist where he still held her, right over her pulse point. And she wondered if he could feel how her heart was racing, if his doctor brain was cataloging the rhythm, or if the man underneath was just as lost in this moment as she was. I'm on your side, Emmett said, his voice rough with emotion he'd been suppressing for decades. And then he was kissing her, or she was kissing him, or they were crashing together like a dam finally breaking. And Elle felt more alive in that moment than she had in months, maybe years, felt her damaged heart beating strong and sure, with something that felt like hope and desire, and the terrifying recognition that she'd been looking for love in all the wrong places when it had been right here all along, steady and patient and waiting for her to be ready. The kiss was everything, desperate and tender, and edged with the fear that time was running out. That Brooke's plan was accelerating, that this might be the only chance they got to acknowledge what had always existed between them. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Emmett rested his forehead against hers and said, Okay, we do this together, but we do it smart. Elle nodded, her mind already racing ahead to the dinner, to the confrontation, to the need for concrete proof. And that's when her phone rang. Not a text this time, but an actual call from her mother Paulette. And Elle answered on speaker so Emmett could hear. Darling! Paulette's cultured voice filled the small office, smooth as silk and sharp as glass. I've spoken with my attorney, and we need to discuss your will tonight. There are some complications with the family trust clause you've included, some legal vulnerabilities that could be exploited. I think it's time we simplified things, perhaps leave everything in Brooke's capable hands without quite so many restrictions. For your own protection, of course. The way she said it, the calculated concern, the subtle pressure, made Elle's blood run cold, because this wasn't a mother worried about her daughter's legacy. This was a chess player, moving pieces into position. And suddenly, Elle understood that the threat wasn't just Brooke acting alone out of greed, but something coordinated, something planned, something that involved the one person Elle had never, ever suspected of betrayal. "Of course, Mother," Elle said, keeping her voice weak and compliant, playing the sick daughter role. "I'll see you at 7. She hung up and met Emmett's horrified gaze, and in that moment, Ella made the decision that would change everything. She wasn't just going to defend herself. She was going to expose them, all of them, and she was going to need to do something drastic to smoke out the truth. Elle wore a wire to dinner, a tiny recording device that Emmett procured through a private investigator friend named Jackson Torrance, a former cop turned security consultant who owed Emmett a favor and asked no questions when they showed up at his office with a story about corporate espionage. Which wasn't entirely a lie, since Priestly Industries was worth $300 million, and someone was definitely trying to steal it through the most permanent hostile takeover imaginable. Emmett's hands were gentle, but clinical, as he taped the microphone beneath Elle's silk blouse, his fingers grazing her collarbone and ribs with the kind of professional detachment that didn't match the heat in his eyes. And Elle found herself hyper-aware of every touch, every breath, every moment of contact that reminded her of their kiss just hours earlier. The kiss that had rewritten their entire history and future in one desperate, perfect moment. "Promise me you'll be careful," Emmett said for the 3rd time, and Elle covered his hand with hers, stilling his nervous adjustment of the wire. "Promise me you'll wait outside in your car, and if anything goes wrong, if I give the signal, you'll call the police immediately," she countered, and the look they shared was weighted with all the things they hadn't said yet, all the conversations they'd need to have if Elle survived this night, if they got the chance to explore what had been simmering between them for a quarter-century. Jackson handed Elle a panic button disguised as a bracelet charm, showed her how to activate it with a double press, and reminded her that he'd be monitoring the audio feed in real time from his surveillance van parked 2 blocks from the Priestly estate. And Elle felt simultaneously protected and terrified, because the safety net they were building meant the danger was real, was immediate, was waiting for her at her own dinner table. The Priestly dining room looked exactly as it always did. Crystal chandelier glittering over mahogany furniture, fine china set for 3, fresh flowers from the garden arranged in the Waterford vase. But tonight it felt like a stage set for something sinister, and Elle noticed details she'd overlooked before. The way Brooke had positioned herself closest to the wine decanter, the way Paulette watched Elle's every movement, with eyes that seemed to calculate rather than love. The way the staff had been dismissed early, which was unusual for a family dinner, but convenient if you were planning to discuss murder. "You look better, darling," Paulette said, kissing Elle's cheek with cool lips that smelled of Chanel No. 5 and secrets. "More color in your face. The new medication must be working." Elle's blood chilled, because she hadn't told her mother about any new medication, which meant Paulette knew about the dosage changes, knew about the contaminated pills, knew and was either complicit or orchestrating. And Elle forced herself to smile and lie. "Yes, Dr. Sachs adjusted my prescription last week. I'm feeling much stronger." She watched carefully for reactions. Brooke's hand tightened on her wine glass, just for a second, and Paulette's eyes narrowed infinitesimally, and Elle knew she'd rattled them, had introduced an unexpected variable into their carefully constructed plan. "Actually," Elle continued, settling into her chair and accepting the wine Brooke poured with hands that didn't shake, even though her heart was hammering against her ribs, "Emmett thinks I might live longer than we initially thought. Years longer, possibly. The condition is stabilizing." The lie hung in the air like a grenade, and Elle watched her mother and sister exchange a look, brief, loaded, almost panicked, and knew she'd been right, knew they'd been counting on her imminent death, banking on it literally. Paulette recovered first, her society-trained composure sliding back into place like armor. That's wonderful news, sweetheart, though it does complicate the estate planning we need to discuss. Your current will ties up so much of the fortune in conditional trusts, and if you're going to live for years, we need to ensure Brooke has access to operational funds for Priestly Industries, for maintaining the properties, for... For what, Mother? Elle interrupted, her voice sharper than intended, months of suspicion and hours of fear making her bold. Brooke doesn't work at Priestly Industries. She's never shown interest in the business. Why would she need operational funds? Brooke flinched like she'd been slapped, and for just a moment, Elle saw something in her twin's face that looked almost like guilt, almost like regret, before it hardened into defensive anger. Because you're not well enough to run it yourself, Brooke shot back, and someone needs to protect what Daddy built. Someone needs to make sure the company doesn't fall apart while you're... She stopped abruptly, and the unfinished sentence hung there, heavy with implication. While you're dying, while you're gone, while we're waiting for you to die. Elle's phone buzzed in her lap. A text from Emmett, who was listening to every word from his car in the circular driveway. Stay calm. You're doing great. I'm here. The simple reassurance steadied her, reminded her she wasn't alone in this, reminded her that someone was fighting for her survival, not for money, but for love. Real love. The kind she'd never had from Christopher, who'd wanted a trophy wife. The kind she'd never felt from her own mother, who seemed to view daughters as assets or liabilities in some grand social calculation. If you're on the edge of your seat right now, let me know in the comments what you think is about to happen. Your theories keep me going, and I love seeing how invested you all get in these stories. I want to see the legal documents you're concerned about, Elle said to Paulette, channeling her father's business acumen, the part of her that had sat in boardrooms since she was 18 and learned to negotiate, to question, to never sign anything without reading the fine print. Paulette's smile was glacial. Of course, darling. I have them right here. She produced a folder from beneath her chair. Pre-planned, Elle noted, meaning this dinner was always meant to be an ambush, and slid it across the table. Elle opened it, scanning the legal language, and felt her stomach drop, because these weren't amendments or recommendations. This was an entirely new will, already drafted, already notarized, just waiting for Elle's signature, and it left everything, every single asset, to Brooke unconditionally, with Paulette named as executor until Brooke turned 35, which meant her mother would control the fortune for 3 more years before Brooke saw a cent. This removes all the family trust provisions, Elle said slowly, looking up to meet her mother's eyes. This cuts out Aunt Rita, Uncle James, all the cousins. This leaves them with nothing. Paulette's expression didn't change. Family charity begins with securing your own legacy first, Elle. Your father would have understood that. He built this empire for his children, not for every distant relative with their hand out. It was such a cold calculation, such a fundamental misunderstanding of who their father had been. A man who'd never forgotten his roots, who'd sent every niece and nephew to college, who'd believed wealth was responsibility, not privilege. That Elle finally understood her mother had never really known her husband at all, had married him for status and money, and built a life on foundations that had nothing to do with love. Elle stood abruptly, the chair scraping against hardwood, and both Brooke and Paulette tensed like they were preparing for confrontation or flight. I need some air, Elle said, pressing her hand to her chest in a gesture she knew would read as cardiac distress, playing the invalid card one more time. I'll review these documents with my own attorney and get back to you." She was almost to the dining room door when Brooke's voice stopped her, small and strained, and nothing like her usual polished confidence. "Ale, wait. There's something I need to—" But Paulette cut her off with a sharp, "Brooke, enough!" And Elle turned back to see her sister's face crumple, to see what looked like genuine anguish in eyes identical to her own. And for the first time, Elle wondered if maybe, possibly, Brooke wasn't the villain of this story, but another victim, another pawn in their mother's chess game. The thought should have been comforting, but instead made everything worse, made the betrayal more complex, made Elle question everything she thought she knew about her family and who was capable of what. And as she walked out into the cool night air where Emmett was waiting by his car, she realized the conspiracy was deeper and darker than she'd imagined. And the only way to the truth was through a plan so drastic it terrified her. Elle collapsed in Emmett's arms before she even reached his car, her legs giving out as the adrenaline crashed, and something else took over. A crushing pressure in her chest that felt different from her usual symptoms, felt urgent and wrong and terrifyingly real. Emmett caught her with the reflexes of someone who'd been waiting to catch her for years, lowering her gently to the gravel driveway while shouting for Jackson to call an ambulance. His fingers ready on her pulse, his face draining of color in the glow of the estate's exterior lights. "Ella, stay with me," he commanded, his doctor voice warring with barely controlled panic. And Elle tried to focus on his face, tried to anchor herself to the present, but the pain was radiating down her arm and up into her jaw, and she knew this was the cumulative effect of weeks or months of poisoning, her damaged heart finally reaching its breaking point. "No ambulance," she gasped, gripping Emmett's jacket with fading strength. "They'll know. They'll finish it. Take me to your clinic." Emmett hesitated for maybe half a second. The Hippocratic Oath versus the reality that Sacred Heart Medical Center had staff who might report to Paulette, who might have access to Elle's room, who might complete what the contaminated pills had started. And then he was lifting her into his car, Jackson already sliding into the driver's seat to speed them to Emmett's private cardiac clinic across town, the one he'd opened for underserved patients, the one place the Priestly influence didn't reach. The next hours blurred together in a haze of EKGs and IV medications, and Emmett's steady hands working to stabilize her heart rhythm, while his face remained a mask of professional calm that didn't match the terror Elle could see in his eyes every time he thought she wasn't looking. When she finally stabilized, when the crushing pain receded to a manageable ache, and the monitors showed something approaching normal sinus rhythm, Elle found herself in a private recovery room, with Emmett sitting beside her bed, his head in his hands, and she realized he was shaking, really shaking, the way people do when they've just survived their worst nightmare. "Hey," she whispered, reaching for him with the hand that wasn't connected to an IV. And when he looked up, she saw tears on his face, saw the careful professional veneer completely shattered. "I almost lost you," Emmett said, his voice raw and broken. "Ella, your heart was in acute distress. The digitalis levels in your blood were—" He stopped, seemed to struggle with something, then continued. "If you'd taken one more contaminated pill, if you'd waited even another day, I wouldn't have been able to save you." The weight of that settled over them like a physical thing, and Elle pulled him closer, ignoring the protest of the AV line, needing to feel his warmth and solidity, and the reality that she was still alive, still here, still fighting. "I can't lose you," Emmett continued, and now he was kissing her forehead, her temples, her lips with desperate tenderness. "I've loved you since we were kids, since before I knew what love was, and I've waited so long, been patient so long, and I won't watch you die because of their greed." Elle's heart monitor beeped faster, responding to the surge of emotion, and she kissed him back with all the fear and hope and desperate longing she'd been suppressing. Kissed him like he was oxygen and she was drowning. And maybe she was. Maybe they both were. Drowning in the impossibility of this timing and this situation, and the brutal fact that falling in love during attempted murder was the worst and best thing that had ever happened to her. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Jackson knocked on the door frame and entered with his laptop, his expression grim. "You need to hear this," he said, pulling up the audio file from Elle's wire, fast-forwarding to a section after she'd left the dining room. Elle heard her mother's voice first. Sharp and angry. "I told you not to waver, Brooke. I told you the plan only works if you commit fully." Then Brooke's voice, thick with tears. "She's my sister, Mom. My twin. I can't just—" "You can, and you will," Paulette interrupted coldly. "The doctors gave her 2 years at most. We're simply accelerating the inevitable and ensuring the money stays where it belongs. With us, not scattered among ungrateful relatives who never appreciated what this family built." Elle felt the air leave her lungs as the recording continued, as her mother laid out the entire conspiracy with chilling clarity. How Paulette had researched Digital's toxicity for months. How she'd recruited Brooke by convincing her Elle's death was inevitable and they were just protecting their inheritance. How Paulette had planned to control the fortune through Brooke for years before her daughter saw a cent. How the whole thing was about power and control, and a fundamental belief that Paulette deserved the Priestly wealth more than anyone, even her own dying daughter. "But tonight changed things," Paulette continued on the recording. "If Elle's condition is really stabilizing, if she has years instead of months, then we need to accelerate. The medication switch isn't working fast enough. We need something more direct, something definitive." Brooke's response was barely audible. "What are you saying?" And Paulette's answer made Elle's blood freeze. "I'm saying we ensure she has an accident, darling. A fall down the stairs, perhaps. Tragic but believable for someone with her condition. It needs to be soon, before she changes her will or brings in outside attorneys. I'm thinking this weekend, at the charity gala." So many people, so much chaos, and her poor heart just gave out. The recording ended, and the silence in the clinic room was absolute, suffocating. The kind of silence that follows a bomb dropping and obliterating everything you thought you knew about your family, your mother, your entire life. Elle couldn't breathe, couldn't process that her own mother, the woman who'd given birth to her, who'd braided her hair and taught her table manners and sat front row at her piano recitals, was not just complicit in her murder, but orchestrating it, planning it with the same cool efficiency she'd once used to plan Elle's debutante ball. "Your mother is the mastermind," Jackson said unnecessarily, stating what they could all hear plainly. "Your sister is involved, but conflicted. They're planning to kill you this weekend at the charity gala, which is 3 days away," Elle finished, her voice hollow. Emmett was gripping her hand so tightly it hurt, and Elle welcomed the pain, needed something physical to anchor her to reality, because nothing else made sense. Because mothers were supposed to protect their children, not plot their deaths, not discuss their murders over dinner wine like it was a minor inconvenience. "We go to the police now," Emmett said firmly. "Tonight. We have evidence. We have the recording. We have the toxicology reports. We have circumstantial evidence of a conversation that Paulette will claim was taken out of context, misunderstood, edited," Elle interrupted, her mind clearing with the kind of cold clarity that comes from absolute betrayal. "My mother has the best attorneys money can buy. She'll tie this up in courts for years, and meanwhile, I'll either be dead from my actual condition or from another accident. She arranges. No, we need something irrefutable, something public, something she can't deny or spin." And that's when the plan formed fully in her mind. The audacious, terrifying, perfect plan that would expose everything and everyone. I need to die, Elle said, meeting Emmett's horrified gaze. Really die. Officially die. Death certificate and funeral and everything. And then I come back at my own funeral and expose her in front of everyone, with cameras rolling, with evidence she can't refute. Emmett started to protest, but Elle continued, urgent now. The pieces falling into place. You can fake my death. You're my doctor. You have the credentials, the access. We say my heart gave out, which it nearly did tonight anyway. We make it look real, make them think they won. And while they're planning my funeral and celebrating their inheritance, I gather everything we need to bury them legally. It's the only way. The plan was insane and dangerous, and required perfect execution. But as Ella looked between Emmett's scared face and Jackson's calculating one, she knew it was also the only path to real justice. To exposing Paulette not just to the police, but to their entire social circle, to the world, to everyone who'd ever looked at the Priestly family and seen perfection instead of poison. Ella died on a Tuesday morning at 6:47 a.m., at least according to the death certificate Emmett signed with hands that trembled so badly he could barely hold the pen. His medical license and entire career now on the line for this woman he loved, for this desperate plan that could destroy them both if it failed. The actual moment was quieter than Elle had imagined death would be. Emmett administering a sedative that would slow her heart rate and respiration to nearly undetectable levels. Enough to fool a cursory examination, but not a thorough autopsy, which meant everything depended on Paulette's arrogance, on her desire to rush the funeral before anyone could ask too many questions, on her belief that she'd finally won. Ella's last conscious sight before the sedative took hold was Emmett's face above hers, tears streaming down his cheeks as he whispered, I love you. Come back to me. And then there was darkness and the terrifying sensation of her body shutting down, her already weak heart slowing to dangerous levels, and the primal fear that maybe this time the death would be real. Maybe her damaged heart couldn't handle the stress. Maybe she'd never wake up to expose Paulette, or kiss Emmett again, or have the life she'd just realized she wanted. She woke 12 hours later, in a safe house Jackson had arranged. A cramped studio apartment in a part of town where no one knew the Priestly name, and Emmett wasn't there. Couldn't be there, because he had to maintain appearances, had to act the grieving family doctor, had to meet with Paulette and Brooke, and sign official documents and arrange for the body that was actually a medical dummy to be transported to the funeral home. And the separation felt like losing a limb, like having her heart ripped out all over again. Jackson explained the situation with clinical detachment. Elle needed to stay hidden, completely hidden. No phone calls or texts or any contact with the outside world because Paulette would be watching everyone, suspicious of any irregularity, and if Elle was discovered before the funeral, the whole plan collapsed, and she'd be vulnerable to another murder attempt, one they might not survive. Emmett can't come here, Jackson said, not unkindly. Any connection between him and this location compromises everything. You're alone until the funeral, and that's 3 days away. 3 days? That felt like 3 years, as Elle sat in that tiny apartment with nothing but a laptop and Jackson's surveillance equipment, watching her own life play out on screens, news coverage of her death, social media tributes from people who'd barely known her, business reports about the future of Priestly Industries, and most devastating footage Jackson had obtained of Brooke and Paulette at the estate, planning the funeral. Brooke looked wrecked, genuinely destroyed, crying in her room when she thought no one was watching, and Elle felt a complicated twist of anger and pity because her twin was suffering, but had also been complicit, had chosen greed over loyalty, had let their mother poison Elle for weeks without stopping it. Paulette, by contrast, was energized, almost gleeful as she planned an extravagant funeral. white roses, and a string quartet, and catering from the most expensive restaurant in the city, spending Elle's money to celebrate Elle's death. And the sheer sociopathy of it made Elle physically ill. The isolation was crushing, worse than Elle had anticipated. The walls of the safe house closing in as she listened to audio feeds and compiled evidence, and tried to ignore the fact that Emmett was out there somewhere, dealing with her family and her funeral arrangements and the weight of having declared the woman he loved legally dead. Her phone, a burner Jackson had provided, remained silent because it had to, because any communication could be traced, and Elle had never felt so alone, not even during her divorce when Christopher had moved out, and she'd wandered their empty mansion realizing she'd married a stranger, because at least then she'd had Emmett to call, had his steady presence to ground her. Now she had nothing but her own thoughts and the terrible evidence accumulating on her laptop. Financial records showing Paulette had been embezzling from Priestly Industries for years, using Elle's illness as cover to transfer assets, planning to pin it all on Brooke if anything was discovered, which meant her mother hadn't just wanted Elle dead. She'd wanted a scapegoat in her own daughter, insurance against her crimes. The betrayal had layers Elle kept discovering, like peeling an infected wound, each revelation worse than the last, and she understood now that Paulette had never loved her, had probably never loved anyone, had viewed her entire family as tools or obstacles in pursuit of wealth and status. On the second night, Elle's actual heart condition flared. Real chest pain, real arrhythmia. The stress and fear and medication withdrawal combining to trigger the very crisis they'd been faking. And she was alone, completely alone, with no way to contact Emmett without compromising everything. No medication because she couldn't risk a pharmacy visit. Nothing but Jackson's emergency number and the knowledge that if she called for help, if she went to a hospital, Paulette would know she was alive and would send someone to finish the job. Elle wrote out the episode on the bathroom floor, her vision graying at the edges, her heart doing a rhythmic jazz in her chest, genuinely unsure if she'd survive the night, and confronted the possibility that she might die here, alone in a safe house, having faked her death only to make it real, never seeing Emmett again, never getting justice, never exposing Paulette or saving her family's legacy. The fear was absolute, primal, the kind that strips away everything else and leaves you face to face with mortality. And Elle understood in that moment what she'd been running from her whole life. Not death itself, but dying without having really lived, without having loved authentically, without having stood up to the people who'd controlled and diminished her. When her heart finally stabilized, when the pain receded and her vision cleared, Elle was different, harder, more resolved, forged in the crucible of genuine terror into someone capable of seeing this through, no matter the cost. The morning of the funeral, Jackson arrived with Elle's disguise, a black wig, glasses, makeup to change her face enough that no one would recognize her in a crowd, and news that made her stomach drop. Emmett had been questioned by police the night before. Paulette having raised concerns about the rushed death certificate, about whether proper protocols had been followed, subtly suggesting Emmett might have been negligent or worse, planting seeds that would destroy his career if Elle's plan failed. She's protecting herself, Jackson explained, creating alternative narratives in case anyone asks questions later. If this goes wrong, if you're discovered, Emmett takes the fall for medical fraud, loses everything, possibly faces criminal charges. The stakes had just doubled, tripled, because now it wasn't just Elle's life and justice on the line, but Emmett's entire future. And she realized with sick clarity that if Paulette suspected anything, if the funeral confrontation didn't work perfectly, she'd destroy Emmett without hesitation, would sacrifice him to protect herself. Elle stood in that cramped bathroom, looking at her disguised reflection, barely recognizing herself, and felt the full weight of what she was about to do. walk into her own funeral, confront her murderous mother, expose a conspiracy in front of hundreds of people, with no guarantee it would work, no safety net, and everything she loved on the line. For the first time since this nightmare began, Elle wondered if she was strong enough, if she could actually pull this off, or if she was about to make everything catastrophically worse. Elle was in the surveillance van with Jackson, parked a block from Sacred Heart Chapel where her funeral was about to begin, watching mourners arrive on the video feed, colleagues from Priestly Industries, society friends of her mother's, distant relatives who'd flown in to pay respects and probably hoping for mentions in the will, when someone knocked on the van's back door in a pattern Jackson had prearranged. And when he opened it, Emmett climbed in, looking haggard and desperate, and so beautifully real that Elle's disguised appearance didn't stop him from crossing the small space in 2 strides and pulling her into his arms. "I had to see you," Emmett breathed against her wig, his hands frantically checking her pulse, her breathing, her physical reality like he needed medical confirmation she was actually alive. "I know it's a risk. I know we agreed no contact, but Ella, I've been losing my mind, and the police questioning, and your mother keeps looking at me like she knows something. And I needed..." Elle kissed him to stop the spiral of words. Kissed him like he was the only solid thing in a world that had turned to quicksand, and felt something inside her settle and strengthen because she wasn't alone. Had never been alone. Not really. Not with Emmett fighting beside her. "I'm okay," she promised when they broke apart, framing his face with her hands. "I'm scared, and my heart is literally failing, and I'm about to crash my own funeral. But I'm okay because you're here, because we're doing this together." Jackson cleared his throat awkwardly and pulled up a new file on his laptop, giving them privacy while pretending to review footage. And Emmett rested his forehead against Ella's, both of them breathing in sync, hearts beating in tandem despite everything. "I brought you something," Emmett said, pulling a flash drive from his pocket. "I broke into your mother's home office last night. Used the key your father gave me years ago when he asked me to check on you during your engagement to Christopher, and I found her personal computer files. Ella, there's everything. Emails to offshore accounts, forged documents, communication with the attorney who drafted the fake will, even searches for untraceable poisons, and how to stage an accident." She documented her own conspiracy. Elle's hands shook as she took the flash drive, understanding the magnitude of what Emmett had done, the risk he'd taken, breaking and entering, and theft of evidence that might not even be admissible in court, but would be devastating in the court of public opinion, especially when displayed at a funeral full of witnesses and media. "You could lose your medical license for this," Elle whispered. "You could go to jail." Emmett's smile was crooked, resigned, entirely unregretful. "Then I guess we both better make sure this works. Because I'm all in, Elle. I've been all in since we were 7 years old, and you told me you were going to marry me someday. And I've been waiting 25 years for you to remember that promise." The memory hit Ella like a physical blow. She had said that, had promised childhood Emmett forever, with the casual certainty of a kid who didn't understand betrayal or death, or the way families could turn toxic, and somewhere along the way she'd forgotten, had looked for love in wrong places and wrong people, had nearly died without recognizing that home had always been right here, steady and patient and waiting. "I remember now," Elle said, crying behind her glasses, and Emmett wiped her tears carefully, mindful of her disguise makeup. "I remember, and when this is over, when Paulette is in prison and I'm officially alive again, I'm going to marry you for real, Emmett Sachs, and we're going to have the life we should have had all along." The declaration hung in the small van like a vow, like a promise that transcended the current nightmare into a future that suddenly felt possible, and Jackson interrupted by saying, "The funeral is starting. Everyone's seated, and your mother is about to give the opening speech. It's time. Elle's fear tried to resurface, but she pushed it down, channeled it into determination, into the fierce protective love she felt for Emmett, and the righteous anger she felt toward Paulette, and the bone-deep need to save her father's legacy from the woman who'd corrupted everything he built. Jackson handed her a remote control for the chapel's projection system. He'd hacked it the night before, loaded Elle's evidence files, set everything up so one button press would interrupt Paulette's speech and broadcast the truth, and explain the timing. Elle would wait for Paulette's eulogy, the moment of maximum attendance and attention, then trigger the video evidence, then walk in personally to prove she was alive. The 1-2 punch that would make denial impossible. "There's one more thing," Jackson said, pulling up another video file. "Your sister Brooke came to see me yesterday. She figured out you might be alive, figured out I was involved somehow, and she wanted to confess." He played the recording of Brooke sitting in his office, makeup streaked and broken, explaining through sobs how Paulette had manipulated her, convinced her Elle's death was inevitable, promised they were just protecting family assets, but how Brooke had realized too late that their mother was using her, planning to frame her for the poisoning, had never intended to share the inheritance at all. "I know I don't deserve forgiveness," Brooke said on the recording, staring directly into Jackson's camera. "I know what I did was unforgivable. But if Elle is alive, if there's any chance to stop Mother, I'll testify. I'll tell everything. I'll help however I can." Elle felt her anger toward Brooke complicate, soften, because her twin had been a victim too, groomed and manipulated by a sociopathic mother, and while Brooke's choices were still wrong, still criminal, still hurtful, Elle understood now that the real evil had always been Paulette, the puppet master pulling strings, destroying her own children for profit. "She's at the funeral," Jackson continued. "She knows the plan. When you reveal yourself, she's going to support you, publicly denounce Paulette, corroborate everything." It was more than Elle had hoped for. Not just evidence, but a living witness. Not just exposure, but family reconciliation, the chance to save Brooke along with herself. And Elle felt something shift inside her, the fear transforming into purpose, into the clear-eyed certainty that this was going to work, that justice was not just possible, but inevitable. She looked at Emmett, at Jackson, at the funeral fees showing Paulette approaching the podium in elegant black, preparing to eulogize the daughter she'd murdered, and Elle knew with absolute conviction that her father was watching somehow, that this moment was what she'd been preparing for her whole life, and that she had the strength and love and evidence to see it through. "Let's go expose a killer," Elle said, and Emmett kissed her one more time for luck, for love, for the future they were about to fight for. And then Elle was stepping out of the van into the bright afternoon, walking towards the chapel where her own funeral was in progress, ready to come back from the dead and reclaim everything that had been stolen, her inheritance, her truth, her life. If you're ready to see how this all goes down, drop a comment with a fire emoji, and let me know you're still with me. We're about to get to the most satisfying part of this entire story, and I promise it's going to be worth it. Elle slipped into Sacred Heart Chapel through the side entrance. Just another mourner in black among the 300 people who'd gathered to say goodbye to someone who wasn't actually dead. And she positioned herself in the back row, where she could see everything. The closed casket at the front covered in white roses. The enlarged photo of herself looking healthy and happy from 2 years ago before the diagnosis. Brooke sitting in the front pew, with her face in her hands, genuinely sobbing, and Paulette at the podium, composed and elegant in Dior, beginning her eulogy with practiced grief. "My darling Elle was taken from us too soon," Paulette said, her voice carrying through the chapel's sound system with perfect modulation. "She was a devoted daughter, a brilliant businesswoman, and a kind soul who wanted nothing more than to ensure her family was cared for after her passing. In her wisdom, she left clear instructions about her estate, trusting those closest to her to honor her legacy. The lies were breathtaking in their audacity, and Ella felt Emmett's presence behind her. He'd entered separately, was standing along the wall near the media cameras that were recording for the local news because Paulette had insisted on coverage, had wanted the spectacle, had wanted everyone to witness her triumph, and now that arrogance would be her downfall. Elle's finger hovered over the remote control in her pocket, waiting for the perfect moment, and Paulette provided it by saying, Elle's final will and testament reflects her deepest wishes, that the Priestly fortune remain unified under single management, that her sister Brooke inherit everything to steward wisely, and that I, as executor, ensure those wishes are honored. Elle trusted us completely, and we will not fail her. The chapel murmured approval, people nodding, buying the narrative completely, and Elle pressed the button. The projection screen behind Paulette blazed to life, and suddenly Elle's face filled it. Not the memorial photo, but live video she'd recorded that morning, very much alive, staring directly into the camera. Hello, everyone, Video Elle said, her voice cutting through the chapel's shocked gasps and screams. As you can see, I'm not actually dead, though my mother and sister certainly tried to make me so. What you're about to watch is evidence of conspiracy, attempted murder, and fraud. The video cut to audio recordings of Paulette and Brooke discussing the poisoning, to screenshots of Paulette's internet searches for toxins, to financial documents showing embezzlement, to the forged will with obvious signs of document manipulation, to medical records proving Digital's poisoning. Each piece of evidence methodically destroying Paulette's lies while the chapel erupted into chaos. People standing and shouting and pulling out phones to record. The media cameras swinging from the screen to Paulette's face, which had gone from composed to absolutely panicked. Paulette tried to grab the podium microphone, tried to shout that it was fake, doctored, a cruel hoax. But her voice was drowned out by the video evidence and the crowd's reaction, and then by an even more shocking development. Brooke standing up from the front pew, turning to face the congregation, and saying in a voice raw with tears and determination, It's all true. Mother orchestrated everything. She convinced me Elle was dying anyway. That we were protecting the family, but she was using me, planning to blame me for the poisoning, planning to control the money herself. I'm guilty, I know that. But the real monster is her. Brooke pointed at Paulette with a shaking hand, and Paulette's mask finally cracked completely, her face contorting with rage, and something darker, something sociopathic and cold. You ungrateful little fool, Paulette hissed at Brooke, forgetting the microphone was still live, broadcasting her venom to everyone. I gave you everything, created this opportunity, and you can't even hold your nerve for one funeral. Elle was always going to die from that defective heart. We just accelerated the timeline and ensured the money stayed where it belongs, with us, not scattered among worthless relatives who never built anything. The admission was everything Elle needed, everything the police would need. Paulette condemning herself on live video in front of 300 witnesses and rolling cameras, and Elle decided it was time for the final revelation. She stood from her back pew, removed her glasses and wig in one smooth motion, and started walking down the center aisle toward her own casket, toward her mother, and the chapel's chaos reached a fever pitch as people recognized her, as they realized the dead woman was walking, as the impossible became undeniable. Emmett moved with her, flanking her right side protectively, and Jackson appeared from another entrance, flanking her left, and together they advanced on Paulette, who stumbled backward from the podium, her face cycling through shock and denial and calculation before landing on pure hatred. You're supposed to be dead, Paulette whispered, and Elle heard decades of resentment in those words. understood finally that her mother had hated her for years, maybe forever. Hated that Elle was her father's favorite. Hated that Elle inherited the business sense. Hated that Elle existed as anything other than a vehicle for Paulette's wealth and status. "I'm very much alive," Elle said calmly, reaching the podium and taking the microphone. "Thanks to Dr. Sachs, who discovered the poisoning, to Jackson Torrance, who helped me fake my death and gather evidence, and to my sister Brooke, who found the courage to tell the truth. Mother, you're done. Your conspiracy is exposed. Your crimes are documented. And the police are already here." Elle gestured to the chapel doors where Detective Morrison and 3 officers had just entered. Jackson had coordinated with them that morning, had provided preliminary evidence, had timed their arrival for maximum impact. And Paulette's face went from red to white as she realized there was no escape, no spin, no way out of what she'd done. "This is absurd," Paulette tried, drawing on reserves of arrogance and entitlement. "I'm Elle Priestly. I'm a pillar of this community, and I will not be—" "You're a murderer," Brooke interrupted, standing beside Elle now, the twins united for the first time in months, maybe years. "You tried to kill your own daughter for money. You manipulated me into helping. And you were planning to throw me to the police if anything went wrong. I have proof. I recorded our conversations. I kept the pills you gave me to swap with Elle's medication, and I'm prepared to testify to everything. The trap was complete, inescapable, evidence from every angle and witnesses everywhere." And Paulette seemed to shrink as Detective Morrison approached, reading her rights in a voice that carried through the utterly silent chapel. "Paulette Priestly, you're under arrest for attempted murder, conspiracy to commit murder, fraud, and embezzlement. You have the right to remain silent." Elle watched her mother being handcuffed, watched the woman who'd given her life now losing her freedom, and felt not triumph exactly, but something more complex. Grief for the mother she'd never actually had, relief that the nightmare was ending, and fierce protective love for the family she was choosing now. Emmett and Brooke, and the relatives Paulette had tried to cut out. The people who mattered more than money or status or the priestly name. Paulette locked eyes with Elle one last time as the officers led her down the aisle, and Elle saw no remorse there, no maternal feeling, just cold rage and the bitter fury of someone who'd gambled everything and lost. "This isn't over," Paulette said, her final threat, but Elle knew it was. The evidence was overwhelming, the witnesses numerous, the case airtight, and she watched her mother disappear through the chapel doors into a police car and out of her life, probably forever. The chapel remained frozen for another beat, the congregation trying to process what they'd witnessed. And then Aunt Rita broke the silence by running to Elle and pulling her into a crushing hug, crying and laughing and saying, "You're alive. Thank God you're alive." And suddenly Elle was surrounded by the family Paulette had tried to disinherit, by cousins and aunts and uncles who loved her for herself, not for what she could give them. And Brooke was there too, hesitant and guilty, but reaching for Elle's hand. "I'm so sorry," Brooke whispered. "I know sorry isn't enough. I know I'll face charges too. But Elle, I'm so desperately sorry." Elle squeezed her twin's hand, not quite forgiveness yet, but understanding. The beginning of possible reconciliation because Brooke had made terrible choices but had ultimately chosen truth over complicity, had helped expose Paulette, had found courage when it mattered most. And then Emmett was there, pulling Elle away from the crowd and into his arms, and Elle finally let herself cry. Let out all the fear and pain and adrenaline of the past week, safe in the knowledge that she'd survived, she'd won, she'd exposed the truth and reclaimed her life. 6 months after Elle Priestly walked into her own funeral and exposed her mother's conspiracy to the world. She stood in a courtroom watching Judge Patterson sentence Paulette to 20 years in prison for attempted murder, fraud, and embezzlement. And Elle felt nothing but profound relief that this chapter was finally, definitively closed. Paulette never apologized, never showed remorse. Even during the trial maintained she'd been acting in the family's best interests. And Elle understood now that her mother was incapable of the kind of self-reflection or empathy that made someone truly human, was a cautionary tale about what happened when you valued money over people, status over soul, winning over love. Brooke sat beside Elle in the courtroom gallery, having taken a plea deal that gave her 3 years probation and mandatory therapy in exchange for her testimony against Paulette. And while the sisters' relationship would never be what it was before the betrayal, they were rebuilding something new, something honest, built on acknowledgement of harm done and genuine effort to change. "She doesn't even look at us," Brooke whispered as the bailiffs led Paulette away in handcuffs. And Elle took her twin's hand, squeezed it gently, and said, "We're not her daughters anymore. We're free." And it was true. The invisible chains of Paulette's manipulation and judgment and toxic ambition had finally broken, leaving Elle and Brooke to figure out who they were without her influence. And that freedom was worth more than any inheritance. The Priestly fortune had been unfrozen after the trial, and Elle's first act as sole heir, Brooke having legally renounced her claim as part of her plea agreement, was to establish the Richard Priestly Family Trusts, named for their father, with provisions that supported every relative who needed it. Medical bills paid for Aunt Rita's cancer treatment, college funds established for 6 cousins, Uncle James's failing business refinanced and restructured, and ongoing support for anyone who fell on hard times, exactly as her father would have wanted, and Paulette had tried to prevent. Elle took over as CEO of Priestly Industries and discovered she was brilliant at it, had inherited her father's instinct for ethical business and innovation, and within 6 months had restructured the company to be more sustainable and profitable than ever, proving that compassion and capitalism weren't mutually exclusive, that you could build wealth while building people up. Her heart condition remained. Hypertrophic cardiomyopathy didn't disappear just because the poisoning stopped. But with proper medication and Emmett's careful monitoring and reduced stress from not having a murderous mother, Elle's prognosis improved significantly, the doctors now estimating decades instead of years, a lifetime instead of a death sentence. She still had hard days when her heart rhythm went chaotic and she had to rest, when mortality felt close and frightening. But she'd learned to hold those moments alongside the good ones, to accept her body's limitations while celebrating everything it could still do. To live fully in whatever time she had instead of waiting for some perfect future that might never come. Emmett had faced a medical board review for his role in faking Elle's death, but the extenuating circumstances, preventing a murder, gathering evidence, acting in his patient's best interest under extraordinary duress, combined with character witnesses and his previously spotless record, resulted in just a formal reprimand and mandatory ethics training. His medical license intact, and his reputation actually enhanced by the story of the doctor who saved his patient through unconventional but ultimately heroic means. He and Elle had moved in together 3 months ago, into a smaller house than the Priestly estate, which Elle had sold. Too many toxic memories. Something cozy and theirs in a neighborhood where people didn't know or care about her last name. And most mornings, Elle woke up to Emmett checking her pulse in her sleep. Old habits and new fears combined with love so deep, it sometimes made her chest ache worse than any cardiac episode. "I'm still here," she'd whisper on those mornings. And he'd smile and kiss her and say, "I know. I just like making sure." And they'd make coffee and plan their day and live the gloriously ordinary life that had nearly been stolen from them. The proposal came on an unremarkable Tuesday evening. No grand gestures or orchestrated romance. Just Emmett looking up from the medical journal he was reading and saying, "Ella, we should get married. Not because of your will or your heart or any practical reason, but because I've loved you since before I understood what love meant, and I want to spend whatever time we have, decades or years, or just this moment, as your husband." Elle had laughed and cried and said yes before he'd even finished talking, and they'd made love on the couch with the kind of desperate tenderness that came from knowing how fragile life was, how easily it could be lost, how precious every heartbeat was when you'd almost had your last. The wedding was small and perfect, held in the same chapel where Elle's funeral had been, reclaiming that space and filling it with joy instead of lies, with only 50 people who actually mattered instead of 300 social climbers and business contacts. Brooke was there, tentative but genuine in her happiness for them, and Aunt Rita cried through the whole ceremony. And Elle wore a simple dress that wasn't designer, wasn't expensive, was just beautiful in hers. And when Emmett said his vows, "I promise to love you in sickness and health, which we've already tested pretty thoroughly, and to check your pulse obsessively, and to remind you every day that you're worth more than any inheritance, any name, any legacy, except the one we build together." Elle knew she'd finally found what she'd been searching for her whole life. Not wealth or status or family approval, but authentic love with someone who saw all of her, the damaged heart, the complicated family, the scars and strength, and chose her anyway, every day, without hesitation. They honeymooned modestly, just a week at a cabin by a lake, where Emmett could monitor her heart, and Elle could breathe clean air, and they could be anonymous and peaceful. And Elle realized that this quiet joy was what she'd almost died without experiencing, what Paulette's greed had nearly stolen, and the fact that she was here, alive, married to her best friend, with decades of possibility ahead instead of months of poison, felt like the greatest victory of all. A year after the funeral that wasn't, Elle stood at the Priestly Industries annual shareholder meeting and announced a new initiative: $50 million allocated to rare cardiac disease research, partnerships with hospitals to provide free treatment for uninsured patients, and the Emmett Sachs Memorial Clinic, named for the living doctor who'd saved her life and many others, expanding to serve 3 more underserved neighborhoods. The shareholders approved unanimously. The stock price rose on the positive publicity, and Elle proved that doing good was also good business, that her father's legacy was in capable hands, that she'd taken the ashes of her mother's betrayal and built something meaningful from them. She still thought about Paulette sometimes, wondered if prison had changed her, or if she remained the cold sociopath who'd plotted her own daughter's murder over dinner wine. But mostly Elle focused forward, on the family trust helping people, on Priestly Industries thriving, on her marriage to Emmett deepening, on the possibility that maybe someday medical advances would fix her heart completely, or maybe they wouldn't, but she'd live fully regardless. Brooke had started working at a nonprofit, channeling her charm and social skills into fundraising for causes that mattered, rebuilding her life one ethical choice at a time. And while she and Elle weren't close the way twins in movies were, they had Sunday dinners sometimes, had honest conversations about their childhood and Paulette's manipulation, had the beginning of something real. Elle's last cardiology appointment showed her heart functioning better than it had in years. And when Emmett reviewed the scans with professional pride and personal relief, Elle kissed him and said, "Guess you're stuck with me for a while longer." And he'd replied, "Forever isn't long enough." And she'd believed him because she finally understood what love actually was. Not possession or transaction or conditional approval, but choosing someone's soul over their assets, their truth over their performance, their happiness over your convenience. That night, lying in bed with Emmett's hand over her heart, feeling it beat steady and strong, Elle reflected on everything she'd survived. The diagnosis that should have killed her, the family that tried to kill her, the conspiracy that nearly succeeded, and the desperate plan that saved her. She'd learned that sometimes you had to die, literally or metaphorically, to learn how to really live. That betrayal could teach you who deserved your trust, that love was worth any risk, and that coming back from your own funeral was the ultimate second chance. The opportunity to build a life based not on what you inherited, but on what you chose, who you loved, and the legacy you created through compassion instead of greed. Elle chose love, chose family, the one she built, not the one she was born into, chose to use her wealth to lift people up, and chose every single day to live authentically and fully. Her damaged heart somehow holding more love and hope and determination than it ever had when it was just physically beating, just keeping her alive without giving her a reason to live. Thank you so much for joining me on Elle's incredible journey from victim to victor, from death to life, from betrayal to love. If this story moved you, if you were on the edge of your seat, if you're celebrating Elle and Emmett's happy ending with me, please hit that subscribe button and drop a comment telling me what moment shocked you most. Was it Paulette's betrayal, the funeral confrontation, or something else? Your engagement means everything, and I can't wait to bring you more stories of triumph, justice, and love. Until next time, remember, your worth isn't determined by your family, your inheritance, or anyone's opinion of you. Is determined by how you love, how you fight for truth, and how you choose to live when given a second chance.